Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode. So Thanksgiving is coming up, and so what better way to celebrate than by talking about poultry? Now, a lot of people want to do their part in Thanksgiving by supporting small-scale farmers, by supporting small-scale agriculture, by supporting animal welfare. There's a lot of people that are concerned about where they source their meat from, the quality of the meat, and the conditions under which the animal was raised. And so to address these concerns, in this episode we'll be focusing specifically on heritage breeds, or standard-bred poultry. I talked to Andrew DeCoriolis from Farm Forward and Frank Reese from Good Shepherd Poultry Ranch. We talk about how industrial agriculture and factory farming in the last 60 to 70 years has completely changed the way we grow chickens and turkeys. It's completely changed the chicken and turkey genome, brought about through the use of modern hybrid breeding techniques. In the same way that industrial agriculture has led to monocrops and to an enormous loss of crop biodiversity, factory farming is eliminating biodiversity in animal breeds. This is especially the case in poultry. And with this gradual loss of heritage breeds, the implications for animal welfare, for the livelihoods of farmers, and for the environment are enormous. And labels such as free-range, pasture-raised, and organic, while perhaps well-intentioned, become completely meaningless if we don't take into account genetics. And so in this episode, we also discuss how Frank and Farm Forward are working together to preserve this diversity and to combat factory farming and to give consumers an alternative. We start off our conversation with Andrew DeCoriolis from Farm Forward.
My name is Andrew DeCoriolis. I'm the Director of Programs at Farm Forward. Farm Forward's a nonprofit focused on promoting conscientious food choices that reduce animal suffering and support sustainable agriculture. So very broadly, we're trying to do two things. One is eliminate the worst practices and ultimately eliminate entirely factory farming, industrial ag. And on the other side is to support and develop models of agriculture and systems of agriculture that raise animals in the highest welfare conditions possible, really in the best ways possible, and make that both profitable and successful. And right now we don't have really a system of agriculture in the United States that promotes that kind of animal agriculture. So that's what Farm Forward's mission is broadly, and the Good Shepherd Poultry Institute is very much an extension of that work. And this is a partnership between Farm Forward and Frank Reese, who's one of the godfathers of American heritage poultry, and has been raising and preserving heritage breeds of poultry, both chicken, turkeys, ducks, geese, waterfowl, for 60 years. So Frank is a really unique person in the American sort of agricultural movement, and our goal with the Institute is to help the next generation of farmers learn how to do what Frank does, which is breed these animals which are genetically healthy and are capable of thriving outdoors and in farms and farm systems that are primarily based on grass and pasture and having animals outdoors, and raise them successfully for a business. And there's a ton of skills that go along with that are today known by very few people. And we think it's important that if we're going to rebuild an agricultural system that's based on good husbandry, that we have to retrain people how to do that. And so that's the role that we see the Good Shepherd Poultry Institute playing.
That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned specifically heritage poultry, I guess, for the Good Shepherd Poultry Institute, but maybe more generally, can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by heritage breeds and how that's maybe different from traditional breeding techniques that we're seeing today in agriculture?
Sure. Yeah. So heritage poultry does have a specific definition. It's been defined by the American Poultry Association as breeds that were introduced into something called the standards of perfection before 1950. So these are basically breeds of animals. If you imagine the Westminster Kennel Club and the Kennel Show for dogs, you go to the Westminster Kennel Club and you see a Rottweiler and you see a Labrador and you see a poodle. What it means to be a poodle is defined very specifically, by how its body looks and how its sort of conformation and shape and in color. There are similar things for poultry. So the American Poultry Association is actually the oldest American agricultural association. And they have been defining and now over the last couple of years, they've begun even certifying flocks of what are called standard-bred or heritage poultry. So if you have a Barred Rock breed, or if you have a New Hampshire, or if you have a Delaware, these are all breeds that look a certain way and act in a certain way. And when it comes to agriculture, we're also historically used for certain purposes. So you might have one breed of chicken that was very good at egg laying, or you might have one chicken that was very good at or very good for producing meat. Or you might have a bird that would be something more like what would be described as dual purpose, where it both lays eggs and also can be eaten. So these breeds and the organization, the American Poultry Association, are really the foundation of the American poultry industry in America. So they've been defining what these breeds mean. They've been putting out what they call these standards of perfection, which describe the breed. They've been doing that every year since like 1860. So they've been doing this a very long time. And these breeds primarily are today used mostly for show, for people who like, the dog clubs, want to breed these animals to show them. There are very few farmers, and Frank is one of the exceptions, who breed and raise them for their intended agricultural purposes. Almost all poultry farmers today raise what are called hybrid poultry, and these are birds that have been bred exclusively to either produce meat or to produce eggs at a very high rate. And because of the way these animals have been bred, they have all kinds of intended health and animal welfare problems. And much of what we see in the industrial agricultural model for raising poultry is built on the animal's genetics and on the very foundation of how these animals are bred to live. So we can talk more about that, but heritage birds are as much a departure from a Cornish cross chicken, and Cornish cross chickens are what everyone in the industry raises today. It's what Tyson raises. It's what Purdue raises. It's what basically every consumer for the last 40 years has come to expect to eat. Is the Cornish cross, and those birds could not be more different, physiologically and behaviorally, and from a taste perspective, they couldn't be more different nutritionally or from an eater's perspective than heritage birds. So it really is a whole new system that we're in some ways going back to, because these are the birds that every farmer in America raised until probably 1960.
Okay, so kind of, I guess, in the name of industrialization and in the name of, I guess, almost capitalism, speeding up the growth rather than looking for health. That's kind of how industrial hybrid breeds emerged. I mean, it was just a response to the demand.
Story. It's actually interesting. The demand was not there. The demand was artificially created by the supply. So it's an interesting story that the USDA in 1949 hosted something called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. And this was a contest that was aimed at producing basically a tastier bird. And a farmer out of California named Vantris won the competition by crossing two heritage breeds, a New Hamp and a Cornish. And this was the first time that the USDA had really put any effort into or money into, I don't know, refining is probably not the right word, but promoting productivity, quote unquote, higher outputs in poultry production. And Vantris actually went on to create a poultry breeding company and popularizing this breed of chicken, or this strain of chicken, as it became increasingly hybridized. And Vantris, Cobb Vantris, is now one of the three largest chicken genetics companies in the world. And consumers think about GMOs, and they think about corn and Monsanto, and they think, oh man, Monsanto owns so much of the corn globally, and what a terrible thing that is, and it's dangerous for all kinds of reasons. Monsanto owns maybe 25% of global corn production, while within the poultry industry there are effectively two companies, maybe three if you add a smaller one, a European one, that own something like 80% of all chicken genetics in the world. So wow. It's something like 20 billion chickens globally every year. And something like 80% of those are owned by these three companies. So it's a complete global monopoly in chicken genetics. One of them is a company called Cobb Vantris. And Vantris was this farmer in California in 1949, sort of kicked off this whole movement. And yeah, the industrial model, really everything that we see about the industrial model, whether it's antibiotics or whether it was cages for egg laying hens, these pieces of equipment, these buildings, these setups, they were all in some ways a response to the genetics, to what was going on genetically with these birds. So as we bred chickens to grow faster or to produce more eggs, there were side effects. You can't push an animal. An animal only has so much genetic energy, and when you make it grow faster or when you make it produce more eggs, something else happens to it. In the case of chickens raised for meat, what are called broiler chickens, it meant that these animals lost much of their natural immunities. Their immune systems became much weaker. And so to compensate for that, we started putting antibiotics and antimicrobials and ionophores into chicken feed. And this allowed farmers to put more birds in houses and keep them indoors than was ever done before. Historically, to keep animals healthy, you kept them in smaller flocks and you let them go outside, and sunshine is a good disinfectant, and smaller flock sizes means you have less sort of disease transferring between animals, and you have less poop on the ground, basically, so you have less opportunity for disease to transfer. But as we put antibiotics and antimicrobials into feed as a regular course of practice, not to treat sick birds, but to sort of keep them healthy or keep them alive even, we were able to put more birds in houses, and we were able to keep them indoors full time. And then it sort of created this cascade, a chain effect of, continuing down this line of breeding the birds to grow faster and changing their environments in such a way to sort of, maximize output effectively, produce as many pounds per square foot as possible. And then when you look at a factory farm today, it makes more sense in the context of that. It's hard to imagine, walking into a modern, factory chicken farm that anyone would choose to do this. But when you imagine that this is sort of a 40-year evolution of slowly making changes that respond to the chicken's genetics, it actually does make a little more sense.
Yeah, it's incredible that, you mentioned Monsanto, and people tend to focus on genetically modified crops, but like you said, there's this, when it comes to poultry, it's the monopoly is enormous. When you're looking, I was just thinking straight away of a free range, for example, as well. I mean, people tend to think as long as I buy free range eggs or as long as I buy free range chicken, in terms of animal welfare, at least, I'm, covering my basis. But, from my understanding here, if you have these hybridized birds that are living in, quote unquote, free range conditions, if they even are free range conditions, you could technically still have animals that are suffering because their skeletal structure is completely transformed in the last 40 years. They're more likely to get, heart and lung infections and so on and so forth. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is this new hybrid bird, regardless of what welfare you provide, obviously it's better if you do provide better welfare, but the problem is very much in the genetics. It's not so much in the environment.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I think to your comment about sort of free range, we can talk about labels and certifications and sort of what those things mean, because there's actually a lot happening, I think, right now within the sort of animal sector where consumers are really waking up to the fact that most of the claims and marketing they read about products is false, and that if they really want something that doesn't come from a factory farm, they have to look for very specific things. And many consumers are educating themselves and are using tools that organizations like Farm Forward create to help them find better products. But going back to what you mentioned, it's exactly right. There, poultry especially, and this is increasingly the case in other animal industries because they're, dairy and the pork industry, and they're following the model of the poultry industry. But simply giving a Cornish cross, access to the outdoors or putting them on a field doesn't solve the problem. It may make the life of that chicken a little bit better. It may not, though. In some cases, I think there's reasons to believe that it may actually make things worse. Modern industrial Cornish cross birds were meant to live in climate-controlled barns, on very specific kinds of flooring and be given very specific diets. These animals are not meant to range outside. They don't walk well. They don't live more than about 40 days. By the last week of their lives, many of them have, trouble standing, much less walking or running or jumping. They have no instincts for what it's like to live outdoors. So solving the problem by putting this unhealthy animal on grass is very much a Band-Aid. And the farmers, and I don't blame farmers at all for doing this, because this is what's available for the most part. When they go to their local hatchery or they, go to their local feed store and want to buy poultry, very likely the only thing that's available to them is Cornish cross. And so, if you're a farmer who's trying to do a diversified operation and trying to raise animals outdoors, you can breed your own cattle. You can find a heritage breed cattle, that cow that can live outdoors. You can find probably a heritage pig. It's very likely that you cannot find a heritage chicken or turkey or duck. And so, I don't at all blame farmers for doing that. And I think it is a positive trend, because it means there's willingness from farmers to put animals back outside, which is a really important step. But it isn't, in our opinion, it isn't solving the problem entirely. These Cornish cross birds that you might be putting outside on grass, they still come from a factory farm. Their parents and their grandparents, literally millions of birds that are kept by these genetics companies to breed that Cornish cross animal, are still raised entirely on factory farms. They're fed antibiotics their entire lives. Some of them are raised in cages. They have terrible modifications done to their bodies to keep them alive and keep them from killing each other. Ultimately to produce that bird that you then may raise on grass for 40 days.
So I asked the exact same question to Frank Reese about free range, and this is what Frank had to say.
It's like I always say, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. I don't care what kind of welfare you try to claim, you cannot make life better for those morbidly obese, deformed animals. To me, one of the worst things they did as far as welfare is that whole movement for cage-free chickens. because those chickens have been genetically engineered and designed to lay 320 eggs a year. They're half the size of what their ancestors were. And so they're using every bit of what energy is available to them to produce an egg every day, stripping their body of any muscle mass and calcium out of their bones, and now you want them to go outside and run around. So, I know people mean well, with some of these rules, but they're actually making life worse for the animals. Unless you go back to a normal, healthy animal. It's like the industry themselves actually said, the modern industrial turkey at maturity is like an 11-year-old child weighing 600 pounds. Now you tell that child that 11 years old, that 3 foot tall, that weighs 600 pounds, now you go outside and play and have a good time.
So we think that we really need to sort of start again with the poultry industry, and starting at the genetics. So starting at how birds are bred and for what purpose, and we want to go back to these these standard breeds, and choose the ones that are most productive, that taste the best, and they really do taste the best. And there's all kinds of evidence to back that up. Really all the best chefs in America who are using poultry are now using heritage poultry, and I think that'll increasingly become the case. But we want to go back to these traditional breeds that are really equipped to be quote unquote free range, but really to live outdoors and live a healthy life without antibiotics, without all of the sort of interventions that are needed today to keep modern Cornish cross poultry alive.
Now, as Andrew already mentioned, when it comes to standard-bred poultry or heritage breed poultry, one of the godfathers, one of the most influential and definitely most inspiring farmers is Frank Reese. I started my conversation with Frank by asking him how he got into farming and why he does what he does.
I've been doing this for, my whole life. I'm fourth generation. So I'll soon be 70 next year, so I've been doing it a long time. I got started because my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents all kept poultry. And when I was a little kid, I was the youngest, and so I was too little to go take care of the pigs, or I was too little to go milk cows, and so they sent me to the chicken house. And so I can't remember not working with them. And we always kept chickens, turkeys, ducks, and geese, everything for our own use. And then I went into 4-H. And so then in 4-H, we showed cattle, we showed hogs, and so I wanted to show my poultry. And that really began my exposure to quality standard-bred poultry, purebred poultry. And I became competitive. If I was going to show my chickens or turkeys or ducks or geese at the county fair or the state fair, I wanted to win. So then I began to meet a lot of the important people. This is back in the 50s. What I considered important people were those people who were raising, the real name for heritage poultry is standard-bred. So that's why I keep calling them standard-bred. Standard-bred poultry or purebred poultry that were not only raising them to win shows, but they were raising them for meat, for eggs. They were raising them for market. And so I got to meet what I considered a lot of my great teachers, the people that taught me how to raise quality poultry. And then as time went on, and I kept raising the same line of Barred Rocks or New Hants or Cornish or Jersey Giants were an important breed to me. And then plus my turkeys, the Bronze, the Narragansetts, the Blacks, the White Spanish, the White Hollands. And I just never, I have raised what I call industrial factory breeds. They're really not breeds. They're industrial hybrid lines of turkeys and chickens, and I just never liked them. They didn't act normal. They didn't walk normal. They didn't reproduce, and I just saw no reason. And plus, I didn't like how they taste. And so I just continued to do this. And then in about the late 80s, 1987, 88, 89, and the early 90s, most of the people whom had been my teachers, had been my mentors, been the people that taught me how to raise quality poultry, they all started dying on me. And so as these farmers passed on or died, their birds were often destroyed. And the family that was left behind had no interest in them. And so I began to realize that if I didn't do something and do something fast, many of these old breeds were going to disappear off the face of the earth. And I didn't want that to happen. And about that same time, Marion Burroughs from the New York Times contacted me. She heard about me through the organization, the Livestock Conservancy out of North Carolina, which I've been a member of since it was started. Told them to call me because what she was looking for was the best tasting turkey in America. And so she was getting turkeys into their kitchen from all the people from around the United States. And she called me and asked me to send her 3 of my breeds. I sent her a Narragansett, a Bourbon Red, and a Bronze. And then she just, I just had to wait. Well, that week of Thanksgiving on the cover of the New York Times was my turkey. And they chose my turkeys as the best tasting turkeys in America. And that sort of started this interest in going back to what they now call heritage turkeys. My mission for Good Shepherd has always been genetic preservation, the saving of biodiversity, because all the chickens and turkeys being sold in grocery stores today are one genetic line. There's absolutely no difference. I don't care if they're free-range, organic, all-natural, Amish-raised, antibiotic-free, they're all the same genetic animal. And so I've worked really hard to try to bring back diversity and keeping it the same mission I've always had, and that is preservation. Like the bronze turkeys I have been here in Kansas on this farm this year now for 100 years. They were brought here in 1917. So it's real important for me that I keep that line going. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really respect that you've been so dedicated to breed conservancy and to keeping this tradition going. And I saw as well that your philosophy at the Good Shepherd Institute is not just about breed conservancy, but also about animal welfare, right? So could you touch a little bit more on animal welfare and why you think it's so important to breed conservancy?
Well, when you get into animal welfare, I guess we were practicing animal welfare forever, long before they came up with all this stuff about animal welfare. The whole idea of improving animal welfare really didn't become a big concern until we started factory farming. My turkeys and my chickens have been out on pasture and free ranging for generations and generations. We have always had the type of genetics, the type of breeds that survive outside. We've never had to feed antibiotics because they didn't need them. My dad always said, if the birds don't look good, put them outside. He said there's no better antibiotic or anything than the sun. So, but that was a very simple explanation to something that's far more complicated. You also have to work with a normal, balanced animal. Within the welfare groups today, they're really pushing towards what they call slow growth, which to me is fake marketing, because there's really not too much difference between fast growth and slow growth chickens. They're still a hybrid animal. They're still a genetically selected animal through multiple mutations to get this heavy-breasted, short-legged animal. And anytime you produce an animal, whether it's a chicken, a turkey, a pig, or whatever, and you focus on one particular characteristic, like fast growth or heavy breasting or heavy muscling, that means the other things that keep the animal happy are sacrificed. I was always taught years ago that if you're going to do chickens or turkeys, you must raise a balanced animal. And that is our job as breeders to keep them balanced. And there's three things that make a balanced animal. One of them is reproduction. The other one is skeletal muscle mass. And the other is health and immunity. And if you select one of those characteristics over the other two, the animal has problems. If you ask that chicken to lay 300 eggs a year, it will have no muscle mass, its skeletal system will fail, and it will have no immunity. If you ask that animal to grow very rapidly and become very heavy-breasted and have this huge belly, it'll have very poor immunity, and it can't reproduce itself. So I've always raised animals that I considered that were balanced. They weren't the best egg layers in the world. Maybe they didn't put on as much muscle mass as fast, but at least the animal was healthy, could still walk normal, could still reproduce itself, and it would have longevity. In fact, that's one of the definitions of a heritage chicken or turkey, is its ability for longevity. That if you don't kill the animal, it will live a normal lifespan. Where all of the industrial factory chickens and turkeys, if you don't kill them at the allotted time that they've been genetically engineered to grow, they will die.
Yeah, regardless of whether they've been raised in so-called free-range conditions or not, they're almost genetically predisposed.
Yep. I always tell people, I don't care how good a welfare, how nice you treat that horse, and you feed it organic feed and you let it run around and eat green grass, you can't make it a zebra. It is what it is at the moment of its conception. The genetics are already there. In fact, that's one of the saddest things. I visited some of these farms that are organic, free-range, pastured. They're supposed to have great welfare. And they're raising the same genetic chickens that the commercial guys, factory farms, raise. And it's really sad to watch those turkeys or those broiler chickens struggle to survive in those environments. Because the industrial turkey of today, or the industrial broiler chicken of today, has been designed to live in confinement. Because they grow so fast, 300 times faster than mine, that you really have to raise them in a sterile environment to try to keep the largest percentage of them alive. It's like there's these campaigns, you're always seeing all the time, why are we feeding antibiotics to healthy animals? Well, they're not feeding antibiotics to healthy animals. They're feeding antibiotics to sick animals.
Right.
The industry would be more than happy to get rid of antibiotics because they would save money. Whatever decision they make, it's probably a better businessman than I am. Whatever decisions they make to meet the bottom dollar. It's all about money. And if they could remove one of the additives to their feed, that's a few cents they would save, and believe me, they would do it. But when you have a chicken or a turkey that is growing, well, the slow growth broilers grow 200 times faster than mine. The fast growth grow 300 times faster than mine. Anytime you have an animal that is having to consume that amount of feed to grow at that speed, their metabolic rate is so rapid that they start having a lot of internal problems. And one of the biggest problems within the industrial broiler is necrotic enteritis, which is a form, I think, of like Crohn's disease. And so the reason they were feeding them and still are feeding them subtherapeutic antibiotics is to try to control the bacterial flora in the gut. Because they are growing so rapidly and they're consuming so much feed, the whole bacterial flora in their digestive system gets all messed up. And the walls get very thin and they start having intestinal, necrotic means the intestines start dying in sections. So they feed them some sub-levels of antibiotics. They don't want to kill all the bacteria. They just want to keep it in control. And they only have to do it for 42 days. That's how fast they grow. Slow growth chickens grow in 52, 62 days, 2 weeks longer.
And how about yours? How about your poultry?
Mine take 160 days. Mine have because there's so much campaign now for fast growth, slow growth, that I call mine normal growth. My chickens grow at the rate that they've grown for the last 5,000 years.
Your chickens are chickens.
Yep. But now you got to realize there's lots and lots, it's like some people say to me, they say, well, because I always, the modern industrial chicken is genetic engineered. And that does not mean genetically modified. They are not GMO animals. They're genetically engineered. That term, genetic engineering, has been around for 100 years. And for thousands of years, farmers have selected certain characteristics that fit their needs. Like the corn that everybody eats today looks nothing like its ancestor. Or the tomato everybody eats looks nothing like its ancestor. But the difference is they just kept selecting within what nature would provide and that would survive within the environment. In other words, they didn't hybridize corn until, the last 70 or 80 years, the first time we started having hybrid corn. And also the word hybrid, if you go back 70 or 80 years ago, often meant just a pollination crossing of two varieties. And, they had hybrid chickens. That's what started the broiler industry back in the 50s. But they took two purebred lines of Cornish game and a Plymouth Rock or a New Hampshire, and they crossed them, and that was an F1 cross, and that was considered a hybrid. And so what they did is they put a little more muscle on the chicken, but it still grew in 16 weeks. The modern industrial chicken we have today and turkey didn't really come about until the late 60s, early 70s. That's how new it is. And in each decade, they were able to get rid of a few more days. If you go back to the 50s, the chicken still took 140, 160 days. And then by the 60s, they had that down to 120. And then in the 70s, they were able to get it down into the 60 days. And then the 2000, they had it down to 52 days. And now we have it down to 42 days. And not only have they got the amount of time down, but the birds are now bigger than ever. There's this huge, morbidly obese animals. They can get a 6-pound live chicken in 42 days. If you go and you buy a 20-pound turkey at the grocery store, it was raised in 12 weeks. And that's not because of antibiotics. It's not because of growth hormones. It's not because of all. It is the mastery of genetic engineering. Most of the all of the industrial chickens and turkeys today, and egg chickens as well, are made up of somewhere between 18 and 20 mutations. So it takes a factory farm to produce those animals. No farmer could do it on their own, which is brilliant because that keeps people from stealing your genetics. You know, they couldn't patent this. They tried. But, the government wouldn't allow them to patent it. That's why they GMO grain, because they could patent it then. That way you can go and sue people if they steal your genetics. But they couldn't do that with chickens. So they just came up with an animal that you can't reproduce. It's a dead-end animal that if you don't butcher it in 42 days or 52 days or 62 days, whatever they've designed, the animal dies. I get those calls a lot from people who will call me and say, hey, we bought some turkeys at our local feed store, and now they can't walk. And so I talk to them, and I find out they have bought broad-breasted whites or broad-breasted bronze, the hybrid turkey. And I said, well, you should have killed it 2 months ago. Or they go ahead and they do process them and they dress out 45 pounds. Because the modern industrial turkey and chicken doesn't quit growing. It'll just keep growing and growing and growing and growing until its skeletal structure gives out.
What seems clear is that animal welfare certainly is a compelling reason to support heritage breeds over hybrid breeds, but it isn't the only reason. By supporting standard-bred poultry and choosing it over hybrid alternatives, you're actually also directly supporting the small-scale farmer over the large-scale corporations that tend to have a monopoly on the hybrid breeds.
Let's say you're a farmer and you want to raise turkeys. The modern sort of conventional turkey that everyone raises today, that the industry raises, that you get from Butterball, is called a broad-breasted white turkey. And these were invented by a guy named George Nicholas in California, starting in the 1940s, but through the 1950s. And this is a bird that, again, was selected to grow as fast as possible on as little feed as possible. And because of that, there have been all kinds of, sort of health and welfare impacts on the bird themselves, one of which is that it is no longer able to breed naturally. So 100% of the turkeys that we eat at Thanksgiving every year were artificially inseminated. And that means that if you're a farmer and you're raising, these broad-breasted white turkeys, just like Monsanto, where you can't save your seeds, you can't save your corn seeds and replant them the next year, farmers can't actually breed broad-breasted white turkeys by themselves and get an offspring that's viable. So that means if you're a poultry farmer in America today, whether it's chicken or turkeys, and you're raising industrial breeds, every year you have to go back to the genetics companies. You have to go back to Cobb or you have to go back to Aviagen to buy these birds, and that's expensive. It's an expense that if you were a farmer in 1950 raising heritage breeds, you didn't have, because you could breed your chickens and they would be able to reproduce naturally. You'd be able to collect the eggs. You'd be able to hatch the next generation of birds and continue to raise them. And those birds would be just as healthy as their parents. It's called conservation of welfare. And that isn't the case anymore. So if you're a farmer today, you're really locked in to this system of buying buying birds from the genetics companies ultimately. And that's even gone further, where if you're a poultry farmer in America today, virtually all of the infrastructure for slaughtering and distributing birds and product basically, are owned by these vertically integrated poultry companies. So folks like Tyson and Sanderson and Purdue. So if you're a poultry farmer and you wanted to raise birds, it's very likely that there isn't a slaughterhouse anywhere near you, and it's likely that there isn't a distribution company that will sell your birds independently. They're all virtually owned by these vertically integrated producers. So it's very hard for farmers to, be independent or to choose to do things differently. If they want to raise animals outside, that's not what Tyson wants. And so if you were a Tyson farmer and you started putting birds outside, it's very likely that they would cancel your contract. That they would say, no, that's not how we want birds to be raised, and we're gonna go with somebody else. So modern poultry production from a farmer's standpoint is very much a serfdom. I mean, it's almost no choice. It's total vertical integration, and it's very little farmer ownership. So I think the picture that most consumers have of, family farmers, and when these poultry companies say they're family farm companies, really what they mean is that they contract with, farmers who all they own is the debt on the barn, which is substantial. So it costs, about $500,000 to build a modern poultry barn. And they own the ship, and everything else, the actual bird themselves, the genetics, the feed, the end product, all of that is owned by the integrators. They're owned by Tyson or Sanderson. And if you're a farmer, you have very little choice about either how you raise birds, what kind of birds you raise. You have no options. And so, because of their, real total dominance in the industry, the 5 or 10 biggest poultry companies own, 95% of the chickens in America. It's very hard for independent farmers to choose to do things differently. So if a farmer like Frank Reese wants to raise heritage birds and send them to a slaughterhouse, he has all kinds of problems that the factory farmed industry has really solved. He has to send his birds to an independently owned slaughterhouse, which is, could be, 5 hours away. He has to figure out how to sell his birds to consumers, whether it's online or at markets or direct. Tyson's figured that out. And all of the things that, an independent farmer would have to do, slaughter and transport, they're going to pay, 5 times as much what Tyson pays to do those things because of their size and sort of vertical integration. So producing poultry outside of the factory farm model or the factory farm system is just much more expensive today than I think consumers are used to. And so the end product then is, for some consumers, feels like kind of a shock because they've been paying this incredibly cheap price for chicken for the last 35 years. And we've come to expect that poultry is going to be, the quote unquote cheap meat. And of course, when, you peel back the layers, there's something cheap about it, but it's at least cheap to the end user, at the point of purchase.
You got to remember why they're doing this. They're not doing this to feed the world. They're not doing this to feed the starving people. They're doing this to feed where their main income comes from. The industrial chicken of today and turkey, but with the chicken, 62% of all the chicken meat being produced worldwide goes into fast food. I mean, the whole reason we have these animals is because of Colonel Sanders and Chick-fil-A and Popeyes and chicken nuggets, McDonald's. That's why we have these animals, because that's where the real money is. There's no money hardly to be made in selling a whole chicken at a grocery store. Are for turkeys, all the whole turkeys being sold in grocery stores are hens, because the toms are too valuable. Because where the real money in turkeys, again, is in value-added products. They can get a 40-pound tom in 19 weeks. And all that meat is turned into the deli meat that you buy at Subway, or that Louis Rich smoked turkey meat, or that turkey bacon, or that ground turkey, or that honeysuckle ham, breast roll or whatever. Because now all of a sudden that frozen turkey that people buy at the grocery store at Thanksgiving for 98 cents a pound, which was just a throwaway giveaway. The real money is if you go over to the deli shop. Now that turkey meat, an 8-ounce package or 6-ounce package of that smoked turkey meat is $5 or $6. And so all of a sudden it's jumped from 98 cents a pound to $12 to $16 a pound. So that's where the real money is. And that's part of the problem I have to face. And me trying to do what I do and trying to sell them is because I have, the industry has done a tremendous job of convincing people that chicken meat and turkey meat is cheap, cheap, cheap food. In fact, they got it so cheap that the industry had to say, hey, we're going to go under if we don't do something. They couldn't undo the cheapness of chicken and turkey meat, so they had to market something new. So they came up with all this other stuff so that they could keep their companies going, which is very good. I'm not putting them down. They're doing what they're doing. They can't back away from their mission, which is to feed into this monster that everybody buys into, whether it's buying that bucket of chicken or those nuggets. And so they've got to produce these animals at the cheapest possible manner they can. I don't have a lot of problems with what the big guys are doing. They're going to do what they're going to do, and they're going after a whole different market. My problem is more with the people who are raising hybrid factory chickens, putting them outside, running them around on grass, and then charging more per pound than I do. Are the people who are selling heritage or calling them heritage turkeys and heritage chickens that are not. And so those are the people I get far more upset over, because it's been very, very important to me that when people buy one of my chickens or my turkeys, that they absolutely know they're getting the authentic, real thing.
That makes sense. So Frank, one final question. What's your vision for the Good Shepherd Poultry Institute? If I understand correctly, you're now trying to educate a new generation of farmers to continue preserving standard breeds, and ultimately, I guess, to push for farming practices and a farming system that just makes a lot more sense?
Yeah, what I'm trying to do is, because I'm getting older and older, is I'm trying to find a way to save this even after I'm gone. And part of what I'm going to have to do is to educate the next generation. And that's going to come through multiple things. One of them is possibly working with individual farmers. I would like to work with students from universities, and we are getting some interest in that, who would send students over here as part of their training to reintroduce people to normal, healthy, standard-bred animals. And how do you raise them? How do I could sell you the best barred rock chickens or the best bronze turkeys in the world, but if you don't know how to breed and select and maintain them generation after generation, they won't look like this. They won't stay where they need to be. So it's reteaching. How do you teach a young farmer to walk into a field of 1,000 turkeys? And I ask them to pick out the best. Go in and pick out the best 5 toms and the best 10 hens. out of that flock of 1,000, because that's what's going to determine what our next generation looks like. Well, what are all the qualities that you've got to look for to do that? And that used to be taught at all land-grant universities, and now it's not taught anywhere. But also I want, the Institute to have a research center. I want it to have a library, an archives. I want to open it to the general public for people to come and to learn and to see and to be re-educated on what's normal and natural. We want to put in a big kitchen. Patrick Martin and that whole group in New York want to have chefs come here and spend time here to relearn how to cook a normal chicken and to share recipes and all this kind of stuff. We want to have dorm rooms where students can actually come here and stay and go through an internship. But my real dream is to teach the teachers, to teach people to go back to North Carolina or California or Washington or Vermont or wherever and work with the local farmers. Most farmers, like myself, can't leave. They're busy farming. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year round, and it's very difficult to go off. So when I was a kid, they used to have county extension agents. They would come out to the farms and visit all the farms and help you improve your crops, improve your livestock, improve your production. Well, that's all gone now. And so I would like to be able to teach people to go out, hopefully a lot of these welfare groups or these various groups like that would send their people here to learn so they could go out and help lots of farmers. And it has to be, you can't teach somebody how to do this in a 2-day seminar. It takes a lot to learn this. And so we're hoping eventually to have, to work with some universities where they can actually send students to come here for a semester, 2 semesters, especially after they've had some biology and some science and some physiology and some biology and microbiology and a few things before they ever get here. So that I can add to that so they understand all the many aspects. How do you control disease naturally? What do you look for in the environment? What type of grass? What type of feed? What are the nutritional needs of these various animals? What's the difference between feeding a turkey, a chicken, a duck, or a goose in the different stages of life? And then also, I want them to go and spend time at our processing plant and learn all the rules and regulations of what is the state requirements, what are the USDA requirements, what are the FSIS requirements, what is humane processing, what do you do if instead of shackling, and how do you make that work? How do you financially make this work?
Part of the piece that we want to try and solve with the Good Shepherd Institute is to create systems, both let's say breeding and hatcheries, but also hopefully and eventually, this is a much longer term vision, but is to begin to rebuild some of the infrastructure that independent farmers need to make poultry production successful. So things like slaughterhouses and post-processing facilities to break down chickens into parts, which is how consumers are mostly used to eating them. They're not used to eating whole birds. They're used to buying drumsticks or thighs or chicken wings. And, all of that kind of infrastructure is today owned by, the very few companies who own most poultry production. So, if we're going to sort of compete with the factory farm industry and create products that consumers have come to expect, there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be rebuilt. So eventually that's a piece that we would love to to work on. And I think with enough farmers who are trained and excited about producing poultry outside of the factory farm industry, it should be very, very possible. We can get you can get loans to build slaughterhouses if you have enough supply. But today there's so few farmers in most places that are raising poultry independently that it's just very hard to rebuild any of that infrastructure.
Yeah, it looks like you really have your work cut out ahead of you. Yeah, no, I just wanted to quickly pick up on what you said about the price and consumer expectations, because I think what I hear a lot is, and I think that's a standard misconception, is that by eating chicken or eating certain meat, you're supporting the poultry farmer, you're supporting the farmer because you're paying for your meat regardless of how cheap it is. And I think, like you mentioned, it's so important to remind people that if first of all, if it's that cheap, there's probably a hidden cost somewhere, and someone's bearing the brunt of that cost. And especially in the case of poultry, you're not necessarily supporting the farmer, even if your intentions are good. By buying chicken, you're not supporting the small farmer. And so I guess my question to you, my last question would be, the Good Shepherd Poultry Institute, they make you seem to be trying to, like you mentioned, bring that infrastructure back and support farmers and provide them with the information to, I guess to bring back heritage breeds. But what can the consumers do from their side? I mean, how can they, for Thanksgiving, for example, which is coming up soon, what can they do? Where can they buy their turkeys to make sure that they're supporting farmers that are trying to bring back heritage breeds, or support Farm Forward or support the Good Shepherd Poultry Institute? What's the role of the consumers?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, consumers play a critical role in this ultimately. I mean, if consumers aren't willing to buy these products ultimately, then there's no chance of ending factory farming. Truly, I mean, there's no chance. If consumers aren't willing to say, yeah, I'll pay a little more for chicken, or I'll go out of my way to find a heritage turkey for Thanksgiving, none of this is ever going to be possible. And so, the thing I would tell consumers is, go buy a heritage chicken, go buy a heritage turkey, support farmers who are really, truly completely outside of the factory farm system. And today that's going to be a challenge. The ways in which you can buy those products are sort of few and far between. But that really, I mean, and I've been doing this about 5 years. Even in the 5 years I've been doing this, availability has really changed. New companies have started to provide these kinds of products. The prices have come down as we begin to rebuild that infrastructure. So I would say, go buy a heritage turkey for Thanksgiving. There are places online you can buy them and have them delivered. Places like Heritage Foods USA, where you can buy turkeys from Frank. In some of the, depending on where you are in the country, if you're most likely in one of the coastal cities, you can probably find a place locally that'll serve these. And begin to integrate these products into your meals. Even if it's once a year, even if it's buying heritage chicken once a month. These products do cost more than conventional chicken, and so if cost is really the issue, what we say is, eat less of it and eat the best. If you're going to eat poultry, really do eat the best. And what we hear from consumers all the time is that once they make the transition, because the end product tastes so much better, it's a fairly easy transition to make. It's usually the sort of first time that's a trouble. That's a struggle, because it's a little bit more money at the checkout counter. But once you've done it, it really has got a lot of rewards. So you can also use tools like buyingpoultry.com, which is a website Farm Forward created to rate poultry products, kind of like a seafood watch for poultry. So we've rated all of the poultry products, basically all of the brands and products sold in the market today, and we can direct consumers towards higher welfare products. So if you want to go find a better egg product in your local supermarket, We can tell you which are the better eggs. If you want to find a heritage product and really buy the best available, we can direct you to the places that offer those. So you can use resources like that. And if you're really excited about Frank and the vision of rebuilding heritage poultry, you can support the Good Shepherd Institute. So this is something that we're in the early stages of right now. We're working on getting architectural drawings for the institute, and we're going to hopefully break ground next year on the buildings, start hosting classes. We've already started doing what we see as one of the really important parts of the institute, which is breeding these birds for other farmers. So offering chicken, baby chicks and eggs, so other farmers can get access to these genetics. And we've been shipping out orders over the last couple of months, several a week to farmers all over the country who want to try and raise these birds. So you can support the Institute directly, and it'll make a huge impact. We need all the support we can get, both from consumers buying products, but also from individuals and supporters who see this vision as really a critical part of the future of American farming. So
that's fantastic. I think I'm a little surprised how, I guess, thank God for the internet, how easy it is nowadays to support these initiatives and yeah, for people that are concerned and that want to support the initiative, that they can just buy these things online and that they can get involved a lot easier nowadays than they might have, 15 years ago. Yeah,
absolutely. 15 years ago, it would have been, your options basically would have been Frank and, finding a restaurant in New York that, happened to sell his turkeys. Mario Batali's been using his turkeys for years and other sort of big name chefs. But, now you can go online and you can have it delivered within 2 days. And so my family's been doing for the last several years. And I think, interestingly, we do Thanksgiving every year with my grandmother, who's 94, and she lives in Arkansas, which is ironically the sort of home of Tyson and many of the poultry companies. And she grew up on a farm in Kansas. And the first time she had Frank's heritage turkeys, she said, "Oh yeah, this is what turkey used to taste like." She remembered what turkey and poultry could taste like. And it was her job when she was the youngest of 7. So it was her job to take care of the chickens, and she remembered the breeds of chickens. And I showed her a picture of some of the birds Frank's raised, and she immediately knew what breed it was. And she's like, "Oh yeah, that's what we raised. We raised Cornish, white Cornish." And, I think, it would be hard for her now to go back to eating an industrial turkey because it just doesn't taste like what she came to expect. So, I hope other consumers sort of find the same. It's a fun culinary journey, and I think it makes any sort of Thanksgiving especially a really special occasion. So
that's fantastic, Andrew. Thanks a lot for this. I really appreciate you taking your time out to share a little bit about what Farm Forward and the Good Shepherd Institute is doing.
Absolutely, Mateo. Happy to do it.
If you want to find out where you can buy your heritage turkeys for this year's Thanksgiving, you can find all the links that Frank and Andrew talked about in the show notes below. You can also, of course, support these initiatives by directly supporting Farm Forward or the Good Shepherd Poultry Institute. Frank was also recently centrally featured in the documentary film Eating Animals, which recently premiered and is narrated by Natalie Portman. It's based on the book Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer, which I highly recommend you all check out. I've also provided the trailer of that documentary in the show notes. That is it for now. As always, guys, if you like this episode or the podcast in general, the best way you can currently support it is by rating, reviewing, and subscribing via iTunes, by recommending the podcast to friends and family that you might think are interested, and by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. The handle for all those social media platforms is For Food's Sake Me. And of course, you can stream the episodes directly by going onto our website, which is www.forfoodsake.me. I'll see you next time.